Welcome to our podcast, Living Our Best with Memory Loss. What makes this podcast unique is that 3 of its hosts, Bob, Denis, and SuAnne, have a memory loss diagnosis. The purpose of this podcast is for people to share their experiences with cognitive decline. It is not to provide medical advice. We are not doctors, and we stress that what might have worked for one person might not work for others. If anything you hear on this program inspires you to explore treatment options, we recommend you do so in consultation with your physician.
Hi, welcome back to our podcast, Living Our Best with Memory Loss. If you have a parent that has dementia, like I do, my mom has it, then you know how challenging it can be. That is why I highly recommend you get this book. It's called The Complete Family Guide to Dementia, Everything You Need to Know to Help Your Parent and Yourself. The authors are journalist Thomas Harrison and leading geriatric psychiatrist Dr. Brent Forrester. They're going to be joining us for 2 podcasts, so part 2 of this one will be released next week, so please tune in to that one. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much. We are all big fans here of this.
Excellent.
What inspired you both to write the book?
Well, I'll answer. I'm a professional writer, and I had 2 grandparents with dementia, and my mom had dementia, and I was her sole caregiver for quite a few years. As a writer, I always thought, well, there must be some book out there that would tell me as a family member what I'm going through and how to deal with this very difficult experience. And I never found that book, and I finally decided that's really a book that should be written. So I decided to write it. And I wanted to work with the best possible person I could find who had a brilliant clinical background. And I was very, very fortunate to find Brent, who is a brilliant clinician and a brilliant researcher and an incredibly wonderful and caring human being. And it was just, it was a great partnership. And that's how the book came about.
And I'll just say, so my name is Brent Forrester, and I've been a geriatric psychiatrist for 30 years. I've cared for a lot of people with various types of dementia, cared for their families, now starting to experience the same problems in my own family. And for many years, I would see people and I felt like a broken record over and over again. I would give similar advice and guidance, and I would meet people at different stages of where they were in the dementia journey. And I always wish I had something to hand people when they walked out of the office, like a guide on what needed to be done next. And when Tom showed up one day in my office at McLean Hospital on the advice of one of my colleagues who had also co-written a book with Tom, I said, we found a great match, let's just say. And it's been an awesome partnership. And I've really appreciated going through this together with Tom.
I think one of the things that we wanted to talk about is that there's a bit of a misconception. It's sort of a theme in your book that folks don't treat dementia, or a lot of folks don't, as a disease. Could you explain that? When you say that, what do you mean by that?
People with dementia can live a long time and they can have a great quality of life. But dementia is a very serious, progressive, debilitating disease that ultimately requires a tremendous amount of care. It's every bit as serious in the end as cancer or diabetes or heart disease or kidney failure. But people don't treat it that way. People look at it as just kind of getting older faster. And they don't treat it with the urgency and the seriousness that they would a diagnosis of cancer, for instance. And the result of that is that they don't plan ahead.
Yeah.
Think about where this disease is going and what's going to be involved as it progresses. And so over the course of the disease, what you often see is there'll be a crisis and the family will respond to that crisis. And then by the time they responded to it, there's another crisis, and then they respond to that, and so forth. What they're not doing is planning ahead in order to prevent or minimize the crises. They're always reacting. And they spend years in crisis mode.
Right.
For
instead of preparing.
Yeah, exactly. And so for the family, that's very debilitating and it's very exhausting. And it leads to a lot of burnout. And if you look at it statistically, Half of all people who are providing care for someone with dementia say they've given up time with their family time. They've given up social life, hobbies, vacations. 30% say they no longer exercise. 40% say their stress is at an extremely high level.
Right.
And 18% say their own physical health has deteriorated, been damaged as a result of caregiving. And that's not what we want. We want people to take care of themselves and in such a way that they can also provide better care for their loved ones. And so a lot of our book is about planning ahead, taking the disease seriously and planning ahead for it so that you can provide better care for your loved one.
I love something that you said in the book, learn how to care smarter, not harder.
Yes. Yeah. People care harder and harder and harder, but that's not what you want. That will just burn you out. You want to care smarter and smarter, and that's better for you and your loved one.
Yeah.
Dr. Forrester, what do you see when patients come to you, especially with your background in mental health? I'm wondering if you can see that cycle that Tom described, and I just wonder again on the clinical side, can you give that perspective?
So building upon what Tom said, I think it's really important to be aware, and Tom alluded to this, that unlike with cancer, heart disease, that often declare themselves based on a biopsy that's positive, let's say for cancer, or a heart attack for heart disease, there's not often a sentinel event in dementia, like a shot across the bow, if you will, like something's all of a sudden happening. When that does happen, by the way, it's usually because someone had surgery or some other medical event, and the disease which had been brewing for years that no one recognized, all of a sudden it's apparent there's a problem, right? And that's because the disease of dementia, like the Alzheimer's type, is brewing in the brain for 2 decades before the symptoms often occur. And there's not the urgency within the general medical settings, say primary care, for screening people in a consistent, thorough, thoughtful way, so that, like with other diseases that we identify all the time through screening, we check cholesterol all the time, we check thyroid problems and PSAs for prostate and mammographies and you name it. We're not consistently screening for cognitive impairment. And there are many reasons for that we can talk about, but so there's the urgency even within the medical community isn't there. And then if there is a problem that's detected because the family member says mom is just not driving safely, or I noticed a problem with her ability to pay the bills, or I'm worried about her memory, um, the primary care clinicians who really are the front line for so much, and we put so much on their backs, they're not trained often to do the thorough workup. They don't feel comfortable making the diagnosis. They don't have the time or the support in their practices to do the essentially the support for families that are needed to guide people through the journey of dementia care. And they feel, whether it's because of ageism and a bias about dementia, like there's the bias of, well, what's the point? There's nothing we can do. They often don't have the perspective of all that we can do to help people once they've even made the diagnosis. So they're often at a loss of like, what do I even tell my patients to do? How do I coach their families? So there's a lot we need. Here's where the opportunity is, and we could talk more about this, but there's such an opportunity to try to create a better system of dementia care, even within the medical setting, that doesn't really even exist today. So by the time they come to me, which was your question, they've often been referred because there's an obvious problem. Unless they happen to be extraordinarily well connected, very aware of their issues, probably very high functioning at baseline. They know that there's this thing called Alzheimer's, that it's a good idea to get diagnosed early, and they proactively reach out in the very early stages. But that's the minority of people that come to our attention.
Aren't there some blood tests now that will show some of that ahead of time?
So, right now, I think it's really important. What I tell my primary care colleagues to remember is that even with blood tests and brain scans and lumbar puncture, spinal taps, even with all of those, which we can talk about, the most important thing that any clinician can do is to get your story, is to find out, when did these symptoms begin in your mind? What does the family think? What was the course of illness like? How long has it been going on? And then to do basic evaluation that you would do with anyone. Good physical exam, a good neurological exam, assess for anxiety and depression, which commonly co-occur and may make the memory symptoms worse. Look for medicine side effects. And when you've done all of that, then you can get into, all right, there seems to be a problem. Let me do more of a cognitive exam. Let me do a functional assessment. And then let me decide, is it worth going after what you're asking about, which are these new blood tests? So these new blood tests, which are available, but not yet paid for by insurance
Very
and are not yet
costly. Yep.
right, very costly. And frankly, Tom, I'm not really, we didn't dwell on these in the book because when it was published 2 years ago, the science has picked up so fast.
Hmm.
These blood tests now can show you if you've got the sticky amyloid plaques and the neurofibrillary tangles of Alzheimer's disease in your brain. Not with a brain biopsy, not after you passed away and we did an autopsy, but literally just by doing a simple blood test. They're not good enough yet, for sure, to predict what will happen down the road. There's some false positives and negatives.
Yeah.
So they're not really ready for prime time, but they will be soon. And once they are, I just caution everyone not to use that as the single diagnostic tool. You still need that full assessment that I just talked about, or else we're running the risk of going down the wrong path and worrying a lot of people.
Because you hear stories of people who have had a lumbar puncture, and the CSF will exhibit proteins, and they don't exhibit symptoms of dementia otherwise. So, and I believe the blood test will yield about the same information that a lumbar puncture would.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what you're describing is what we call in the field preclinical Alzheimer's disease. In other words, the biology is present in the brain, plaques and tangles, but there are zero symptoms.
Right.
And again, this could be a 10 to 15 to 20-year process of no symptoms, but with disease in the brain. And that's where a lot of the research is, honestly, is like, so what do we do with this big group of people who are out there every day, who may have this biology in their brain, but yet don't have symptoms? Do we have an opportunity to intervene with lifestyle changes, maybe with medication interventions, to try to prevent the onset of symptoms or delay the onset of symptoms?
What also occurs to me is exactly what Tom was talking about earlier, is that would also give you an opportunity to plan, and it isn't necessarily a predictor of when symptoms will start or how bad they'll be, but the name of our podcast, Living Our Best with Memory Loss, it would enable you to make the types of plans for your worst case scenario, but you would talk about that more. And I think in America, we don't like to talk about issues prior to death. We're very death phobic. We just don't want to believe it's going to happen to us, but everybody needs to make a plan. And what kinds of interventions would you want towards the end of your life? And so I think it would be awesome, take the trip, eat dessert first, whatever you wanted to do to have your best life, But it just seems like an opportunity on so many levels that you both have spoken about.
Yeah.
So
I think the good news about dementia is that it typically develops very slowly. And that means that you have time to plan, and you have time to think, and you have time to look ahead. And that's great. The bad news about dementia is that it often develops very slowly. And so family members say, oh, well, this doesn't seem so bad, right? Because at the beginning, the person's not in pain. They're not being treated in a medical setting. There are no decisions you have to make right away. And so rather than say, oh, we have time to plan, what the family says is, oh, well, this doesn't seem so bad. We'll take it one day at a time. That's
Right.
the biggest mistake that families make, is you can't cross those bridges when you get to them. You have to cross all your bridges right.
Well, Tom, one thing related to that, why I love the book, folks are going to think I'm like on commission here with the book, but seriously, this is what I love. There's a section that says how you can tell. And one day we were discussing, symptoms, and I believe it was SuAnne that turned around and said, but I always walk into a room and forget, God, why did I come in here? What was I doing in here? What was I getting? And Denis made a joke and say, yeah, but that's pretty normal, SuAnne. I walk into the bathroom bathroom. When I think
Or
that
I
I'm
walk into
going,
the closet.
you walk into the closet.
So
Exactly.
there are days when half the time I'm walking into the wrong room, and very regularly I'll walk into a closet in a house I've lived in for 22 years. So
But I do love the idea that in the book that it says, how can you tell? And there's a whole column here, more likely to be normal aging. And then there's a whole column that says more likely to be dementia. And just that as a resource alone, a number of pages devoted to that, where folks can, at least if they detect something early on, and like, Dr. Forrester said, sometimes our primary care physicians aren't equipped. And so that's why, again, as I said, if somebody just even suspects, or it's nice to pick this up and look at it and read it, and so like you said, early diagnosis, or someone at least just making the move to make an appointment with the doctor, because then you also have to deal, I would imagine, with folks who are in denial, both.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And
Both people with the disease and family members
yes.
are often both in denial, or one is and the other isn't. But denial is very real.
Yes. Go
You
ahead.
know, one thing I'll just say about the denial, it's the defenses of both denial and minimization are protection mechanisms of facing fear and the unknown. And the denial and the minimization may not just be with the person with the illness and the family, but sometimes it's with the clinician, the primary care clinician, who may have a 40-year relationship with the patient or a 30-year relationship with a patient. After a while, it feels like family. Unfortunately, those relationships aren't like they used to be, but I've seen this where physicians are like, they seem fine to me because they've retained their social graces and their expressive language is fine.
Yeah.
And unless you really probe and give them a little bit of a brain stress test, you're not going to see the problem.
yeah, and the minimization uh, is especially, you'll especially see it with a high functioning person, with his physician or her physician. When he comes in, she comes in complaining about cognitive issues, cognitive losses. I can no longer process. I have some memory issues. I can't think as deeply. I can't do the things that I've been paid to do for a career. And the doctor, your GP will say, you have an outstanding vocabulary. You can reason. You're articulate. There's a little word slippage, but you're 65 years old. And minimize your complaint. And in my case, that happened for 2 successive years, complaining to my physician that something is amiss. And it was only in the third consecutive yearly visit that she finally said, I'm going to get you with a specialist. And that reference was finally made. But those were 2 lost years. Now, I don't know if there was a medication that could have helped. I don't know if there was a therapy that could have helped, but acknowledging the issue for what it was would have been
But also
pertinent.
maybe to allow what the book strongly advises, to start pre-planning.
Yeah.
That if something, to start pre-planning, and maybe you could have gotten, and I'm certainly out of my realm here, but on an Aricept or something that would, obviously there's no cure, but something that could maybe stave off the disease. I don't know. This is your department.
Yeah, I can address that, but I'll just say the story you just gave of the delay. And you mentioned often it's high functioning folks where there's this minimization and a delay. The sort of concept you were describing really nicely is what we call cognitive reserve. So people who generally are higher, you know, they got advanced degrees, function really well in their careers, higher IQs. It takes more. This is a simple concept. It takes more degeneration of brain cells to see symptoms in someone who had a higher level of intellect or cognitive functioning at baseline. And when the disease starts to take hold in the brain and lead to the death of brain cells and the disruption of the circuits in the brain, you can hold things together for quite a while. And then something may change. Maybe there's a mini stroke. Maybe there's further progression of the illness. Maybe there was a medical problem or a new medicine side effect. Then the decline can be more precipitous. And so we often see that pattern. And like you were saying before, earlier intervention, preparing ahead of time with all of the things. So you still have the capacity to decide what you want the rest of your life to look like.
Exactly.
That should be very empowering. And if we wait too late, then unfortunately the person often doesn't even have say in what they want. And that's really a problem. Tom?
Yeah, when we talk about planning ahead, I mean, you mentioned planning for medical interventions, and of course that's important, but there are a tremendous number of practical issues that need to be planned for. Legal and financial issues, because once a person is no longer legally competent to handle their assets, who is? And if no one is, then you have a problem, as well as planning legally and financially for the kind of care you might need. Safety issues. How are you going to protect the person when they're in danger of falling, or maybe they can no longer use the kitchen safely, or maybe they're a danger there are dangers when they're taking showers in the bathroom. Driving. What happens when they can no longer drive? Because a lot of people do not want to voluntarily give up their car keys. That's something that has to be planned around. Any kind of outside services, whether it's something as simple as housekeeping or personal care assistance to a full-time care facility, all those things need to be planned for because they're financial issues. You want to choose the right place. They're often waiting lists, and often the need arises in a crisis. So you want to plan ahead. And behavioral symptoms, difficult behavioral symptoms. How can you prevent them and minimize them and deal with them effectively? Those are all communication skills. These are all things that, and we go into all this in the book, these are all ways of planning ahead that make the caring for this disease manageable rather than an immense burden.
I could really appreciate just the detail. And I like what Lori said. It's very readable for folks. It's very practical and so important. All those aspects that you just listed are really important for folks to be planning for. And I really love what you've put together. I'm going to order. We are in a support group. Denis and I are, and we have a care partner group down the hall that meets. And I have a little mobile library I carry around, and I'm ordering several of these to go in that. And so I'm very excited to see this good stuff in print. And I appreciate both of you for doing it.
We appreciate you. That's great.
Thank you.
And I know you're going to join us for our next podcast. And in that one, I want to talk about when you are faced with the task of approaching your loved one and finally making a decision to put them in a memory care facility, which is difficult. And so we will see you next week on our next podcast and discuss it. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you, Lori.
Thank you.
So much.
Please follow our next podcast that's released next week with Dr. Forrester and Tom Harrison as we discuss the book even more, and my favorite chapter where I get so much advice on the steps to take when admitting your parent to a memory care facility.